Here are a bunch of arguments for God from people who make excuses for their religion for a living.
I asked 100 leading Christian apologists what they think is the best argument for the existence of God. William Lane Craig, Wes Huff, Nancy Pearcey, Alan Parr, Trent Horn, Stuart Connectley, and more. Some of the answers were completely expected, and some of them totally took me by surprise. We're gonna look at 5 categories from the least cited to the most cited, most popular, and highlight some crucial apologists along the way. We're also gonna look at why Os Guinness and Doug Grotice wouldn't answer my question.
Was it because you struggled to pronounce their names?
Let's start with the smallest category, which I've dubbed existential. These are kind of personal encounters or experiences with God. So for example, this is one that surprised me. The great John Lennox said a transformed life he considers the best evidence for the existence of God.
Even if it were the case that no atheist has ever managed to turn their life around, and it isn't, how is this evidence for a supernatural creator? I wouldn't even consider a clear violation of the laws of physics to be convincing evidence of God. But something that's entirely possible without a miracle is the best argument?
So think about that. Oxford professor, science and philosophy and religious background, says a changed life is the most powerful piece of evidence for God.
I hope they get better from here.
So by transformed life, we mean somebody whose life is broken in some sense and then is transformed by Jesus. Of course, we see this in the Bible when the blind man in John says, "All I know is I was blind, but now I see."
If that happens to a Muslim or a Hindu, is that equally strong evidence for those religions?
It's someone's testimony or experience of transformation by God. The next category, I dubbed this one unique arguments. These are arguments that 1 or 2 people held, and I kind of lumped them together. So J. Steve Miller, if you follow this channel, you'll recognize I've had him on a bunch of times to talk about near-death experiences. He's the only one that cited near-death experiences.
How are near-death experiences evidence of God? First of all, if they only happen near death, they aren't evidence of what happens after death. But even if they were, the existence of an afterlife is also not evidence of God. It could be the case that there's an afterlife, but still no God. Perhaps some people with these experiences claim they saw visions of God, but people who haven't gotten anywhere near death sometimes claim to see God too. So why are these experiences any stronger evidence than any other vision claimed to be divine?
Now, I think this is a huge growing field more apologists need to lead into, but he's done some amazing work on that. Trent Horn, a Catholic apologist, was the only one who said contingency. Now, this is a kind of causological argument, but it moves from the existence of contingent things, like the universe, that didn't have to exist, as saying the best explanation for its existence is a necessary being.
How does he know that the universe is contingent? If God can exist without being contingent, why can't the universe? If it's because the universe has only existed for a finite amount of time rather than being eternal, if that is in fact the case, well, God has also only existed for a finite amount of time, because since the universe is the space-time continuum, if the universe had a beginning, time must have as well. If the universe is not eternal because time itself is not eternal, then nothing can be eternal, not even God.
Now, 2 people, Mary Jo Sharp and Ruslan KD, said the argument from reason. And there's different versions of this that C.S. Lewis and Alvin Plantinga gave, but it's basically a move from the reliability of our cognitive faculties to understand truth in the world to the best explanation being not some naturalistic blind process, but that we were built to understand truth in a certain fashion.
It doesn't look like we were, though. If we were built to understand truth, especially if we were built by an all-powerful God, one would expect that we would be a lot better at it. Rather, it looks like our cognitive faculties evolved to help us survive on this planet rather than accurately understand or perceive it. There are illusions that we experience that don't accurately portray reality but help us navigate it better. This seems much more consistent with being built for survival rather than for obtaining truth.
This optical illusion is called simultaneous brightness contrast. The dot appears to become brighter as I move it up and darker as I move it down, even though its color never changes. And believe it or not, we still don't know what causes it. All we know is that somehow, somewhere in the brain, we forfeit truth for exaggerated contrast difference. Recent studies have suggested that we may be born to make this mistake, and that makes sense. It may be an error, but it may also help us more quickly distinguish features in the environment. Natural selection may have favored this over accuracy because sometimes it's more important to live than to see reality as it is.
There's some other arguments, transcendental argument,
The transcendental argument is also an argument from reason.
consciousness.
Consciousness is a set of activities like thinking, perceiving, feeling, etc. What is carrying out these processes if not the brain? I'm sure a theist would say the soul does them, but if that's the case, why do we do these things differently when our brains are physically or pharmaceutically altered? Do these alterations affect the soul too? Also, even if there is a soul, it wouldn't follow from that fact that there is also a God.
And the argument from desire that people gave as well.
The argument from desire is the weirdest one. It says that God probably exists because so many people want there to be a God. It's a complete non sequitur.
Now, the third category, this was given by 15 apologists that I asked, and this is basically the evidence for Jesus. So this could be the life, the teachings, the impact, or the miracles of Jesus.
None of the evidence for Jesus is sufficient to convince me that he performed any miracles, and even if it were, it still wouldn't follow that he was therefore God. As Christopher Hitchens said,
So I'll give you all the miracles, and you'll still be left exactly where you are now, holding an empty sack.
They consider the best evidence for God. Now, this first one, let's say the least surprising thing in this entire study is, of course, Gary Habermas, who's probably studied the resurrection as much or more than anyone who's ever lived, said, drumroll, the resurrection.
even if one could demonstrate that Jesus rose from the dead, that would just mean that he has the power to rise from the dead. It wouldn't mean that he is all-powerful.
But Catholic apologists Stephanie Gray Connors and Stuart Conneckley also specifically said the resurrection. Now, interestingly enough, my father, Josh McDowell, was the only one who responded with fulfilled prophecy. Now, he's made a case for the scriptures and the resurrection, but fulfilled prophecy being the most compelling evidence for the existence of God.
Every prophecy I've ever seen an apologist cite as one that Jesus fulfilled has either not been about Jesus, like the one about the suffering servant in Isaiah 53, which Isaiah 49 explicitly says is actually about Jacob, sometimes called Israel, or wasn't really fulfilled by Jesus. The Messiah, for example, was never prophesied to be crucified and rise from the grave. William Lane Craig has actually even cited this fact as evidence that Jews of Jesus' day were unlikely to make up the resurrection to make it look like Jesus was the Messiah, because the story of Jesus doesn't match the prophecies about the Messiah.
And of course, there's a number of other wonderful apologists that point to Jesus. The next category is the moral argument. There's different versions of the moral argument, but it's basically a move from the existence of objective morality that we all know and see and expect others to follow.
I don't know it, see it, or expect others to follow it.
To the best explanation being a moral law giver.
So it starts with a premise that isn't true and draws a conclusion that wouldn't follow even if it were. Even if there were objective morality, the existence of a God would not explain it, because there would be no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to follow God's morality. Even if there is a God who dictates morality to us, and even if we consider that God an object for some reason, the only ultimate reason to do what that God says is because God says so.
So the moral law points towards a moral law giver. So this is actually 23 people gave this. Now this first one, no surprise, Paul Copan, who's been one of the most able and consistent defenders of the moral argument for God today, but also Wes Huff, Gavin Ortland, the one and only Greg Kokel. We've got a UK apologist in here, Justin Brierley, and Nate Sala, also point towards the moral argument.
It's interesting how many apologists prefer the argument that is effectively circular.
The number one category, and you could probably know what it is by this point, 52 of the apologists I asked said creation.
This is effectively a special pleading argument because it's based on the premise that everything which exists needs a creator other than God.
Now, some just said creation in general. Some said like the cosmological argument. Some said fine-tuning, the origin of life. But something about creation pointing towards a creator.
Creation by definition points to a creator, but how do you tell whether something is a creation or not?
Was the number one response. Creation refers to a bunch of different particular aspects of the universe that seemingly point towards God. So the Clom cosmological argument points to the beginning of the universe, to there being a beginner.
This is William Lane Craig's favorite argument, and he believes that the universe had to have a beginning because he thinks the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem says that time itself had to have a beginning. It does make sense that if time itself had a beginning, everything else would also have to have a beginning, but that would include God. If the universe can't have existed for an eternity because time itself hasn't existed for an eternity, then neither can God. Craig insists that God can be eternal even though there hasn't been an eternity in which God could exist.
So whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause.
If the reason the universe began to exist is because time itself had a beginning, which would be the case by definition given that the universe is the space-time continuum, then God began to exist as well. However, I don't think time, even if it has a beginning, can have a cause because you can't cause something to begin to exist when it already exists. And even if time has not existed infinitely, there was still obviously never a time when time didn't already exist.
Fine-tuning points towards certain laws of physics and cosmology that exist within a very narrow range where the slightest change in those numbers would make the universe inhospitable to life.
Ironically, this is only true if there is no God. If an all-powerful God exists, then he could put life into a universe with any set of constants and laws.
So the fine-tuning seems best explained by a fine-tuner.
It's much more parsimoniously explained by the laws of the universe simply not being free to vary. The mere fact that we can imagine these laws and constants being different does not mean they actually could have been.
Others would be the origin of life, the amount of DNA you find in a cell, the complexity of information points towards a mind or an author of life.
No, it doesn't. Neither complexity nor information need to come from a mind. Information is just non-randomness, and if you have lots of non-random things interacting with each other, you can end up with some very complex non-random systems.
Now, this first one will not shock you at all. Of course, William Lane Craig, when I asked him, he looked at me with a little smirk and he's just like, cosmological. The Kalam argument, of course. But two others kind of surprised me. J. Warner Wallace and Lee Strobel, who both two of their first influential books kind of investigating the historical Jesus, both said the Kalam cosmological argument is the single best piece of evidence for God.
The fatal flaw of that argument is that it insists that the universe can be created despite the fact that there was never a time when it didn't already exist.
Nancy Pearcey agreed. This one slightly surprised me. Titus Kennedy, who's an archaeologist, specifically said the Kalam. Hilary Ferrer with Mama Bear Apologetics, she goes, that's easy. And she didn't just say creation, she said protein and protein synthesis. That was very specific.
That's an especially weird one, given that we know a lot about the mechanics of how that works. I have no idea why she thinks it's magic. Is it because it's complicated and she makes the baseless assumption that complicated things have to be designed?
Hugh Ross, no surprise, said fine-tuning. And Bible teacher, YouTuber Mike Winger also said creation. And again, there's a bunch of other amazing apologists that pointed towards creation as the best piece of evidence.
Sometimes people think creation is evidence of God because they assume that nothingness is the default state of reality and existence is some kind of deviation that requires explanation. There is no reason to think this is the case, and if there were, there would be no reason to exempt God from this principle.
And I thought it was interesting that two apologists that I just respect and love and have had on this program didn't answer or wouldn't answer my query. But I think there's wisdom in why they don't. Os Guinness said, quote, the best argument is the best argument for the specific person. In other words, there is no best argument.
Sounds to me like he's saying the opposite, that they are all potentially the best argument if there is even one person for each argument who finds that particular argument the most convincing.
There's a lot of wisdom in that. Instead of saying, here's what I think is the best, I'm going to force it on you, is finding what's interesting for a person and try to prevent something that might be compelling to them. Doug Groteis said, I cannot do that. Too simplistic. It depends upon what best means. I'm a cumulative case guy, so I think we need several to make the case.
I agree that no single argument works, but I also don't see how any combination of them is convincing either.
Now, that didn't surprise me because Doug is a careful philosopher and wanted to nuance things. But there's something to be said. I actually think most apologists in this group would agree that it's not just one argument. It's the weight of different arguments, philosophical and moral and experiential and historical.
And even all of them put together are incapable of overcoming the fundamental incoherence of the concept of God.
That point towards the existence of God, and particularly the Christian God. And I know some of you watching this might be thinking, what's my argument? I actually really wrestled with this, but if I had to pick one, I think I would go with the moral argument.
The circular one?
And I think the reason is because it's not just intellectual, although it is, it's experiential. We feel it.
I don't. I feel that there are things that are intolerable to my conscience, but this just seems like a reaction of my own personal conscience. Absolutely nothing gives me any inkling that the reaction of my conscience is actually the perception of some metaphysically, platonically existing objective morality.
We don't just talk about evil. We've seen it. We've experienced it.
I haven't, at least not in any way that even remotely resembles the perception of an objective phenomenon.
and our hearts cry out for justice, I think it's an argument that's not only biblical. We see it in Romans chapter 2, that God has written morality on our hearts and our consciences.
Then why did it need to be written in a book? And why is it that what my conscience insists upon is often the diametric opposite of what Scripture prescribes?
But it's just a part of the world, and we cry out for justice.
I suppose there's a sense in which my conscience is part of the world because it's part of me and I live in the world, but that doesn't make it objective in the sense that it applies to everyone.
And I'm convinced that a biblical worldview offers the best response. So I want to point towards the resurrection, but if I had one argument, I think I would probably use the moral argument.
Even if there were a God who dictated morality to us, that still wouldn't make morality objective because there's no objective, non-circular reason why we ought to do what God tells us to do.
Now, I tried isolating different groups in the data. I tried to look at female apologists, online apologists, Catholic apologists versus Protestant apologists, and I didn't really see any regular patterns emerge, but I'd love to know what you think. I'm going to put the data in the notes of the 100, it's actually 100 plus apologists. And if you look at it and you see any patterns or things that jump out to you, let me know.
I've noticed a pattern of these arguments being entirely unconvincing.
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.